Hello and welcome to my review of my Club 100 2021 season. So 2021 was my first season racing in Sprint 60 and my second season racing in Club 100. So the Sprint 60 format consists of two 30-minute races with a 15-minute combined qualifying and practice session. The reason why I switched from sprints to Sprint 60 was primarily that I thought having more track time, more seat time would help improve my karting, and it certainly did that, and I'm glad I made the decision to switch from sprints. Although I still enjoyed my first season racing in sprints, I did struggle a bit, found it a bit full on because of the nature of the really short races, and never really felt comfortable. So having the longer races and the longer time on track definitely did help. So overall, I think the season was positive from that point of view. I definitely learned a lot, and I think I fundamentally was a quicker driver coming into the season than I was at the start. Still a number of things I need to work on, and I talk about those in the video on a number of occasions. Now, as I mentioned, I've now raced 2 seasons with Club 100. Both of them have been impacted by COVID. Neither of them have been what you call normal. We've had varying restrictions and breaks and things like that. I, like everyone, am hoping that 2022 will be a much more normal experience for all of us. And before we finish talking about 2021, I just have to mention the virtual side of my Club 100 racing this year. So when COVID really started to bite, a number of the guys who race in Club 100 decided to set up an official iRacing championship, fully endorsed by Club 100 and with some prizes provided by Club 100. And I signed up for that and did almost the entire season. I think I only missed 1 or 2 rounds, and that was down to technical problems more than anything else. There are 2 classes depending on your experience, effectively your iRating, so how good you are in iRacing. iRacing Class 2, and I'm very happy to say that I managed to finish 3rd overall. So I actually managed to score a podium. Okay, it's in the virtual world, and I didn't get a trophy, but I still managed to score a podium, which was really good. And I just missed out on actually finishing 2nd by I think about 20 points or something, so pretty positive overall from that point of view. So before we get on to the race footage and kind of my individual thoughts about the individual races, just a quick chat about 2022. So my original intention was to race in Sprint 60 again. That's what I wanted to do, but like many people in the heavyweight division of SP60, I didn't manage to get a spot on the grid, just simply because the entry for that class is massively oversubscribed. I think the reserve list is something like 40 or 50 deep, which is absolutely crazy. And I guess I should just consider myself lucky for managing to race in 21 with that group. So in 2022, I'm still going to be doing something that's like Sprint 60, but it's not called Sprint 60. It's actually going to be an offshoot of the Club 100 Experience Championship, but we're going to be running a separate event just for heavyweights. So basically the overspill from Sprint 60, we're still going to get our 2 half-hour races in our qualifying, so it's exactly the same format, but it's just not called Sprint 60. But that's only over 7 rounds, and I did want to kind of campaign a similar full season to the one I did in 21. So I'm also filling in with 3 sprints, which also happen to be some tracks I desperately wanted to go back to. So I'm doing the full experience calendar, which starts at Shennington in March. But in addition to that, I'll be racing sprints at Rye House, Ellough and Llandow. And as I talk about in the video later on, I love Ellough and Llandow a lot, so I'm really happy to be going back there, and certainly Llandow was my strongest performance of the season. I'm hoping that translates to a good performance in sprints as well. And the final thing is, in sprints I will be racing in my weight category. So when I raced sprints in 2020, I raced in class 3, which means you start at the back of the grid with a random grid slot. By racing in my weight category, super heavyweight, I will be racing with, in my 3 heats, a front, mid and rear grid slot. So hopefully that gives me the opportunity to get some good results, because I'll be starting further up the grid, and as long as I can make a decent start and not tank on lap 1, by the time the field spread starts to kick in, hopefully that means I've got a reasonable chance of putting some good results out in those sprint rounds that I'm contesting next year. And of course, or this year rather, sorry, it's now 2022, isn't it? Also means I'll be making the odd appearance on the live streams with Alpha Live. And the final point to note is I am also going to be defending my monumental 3rd place finish in the Club100 iRacing Championship this year. So that will also be, I think, bar 2 or 3 rounds, that's also live streamed. So if people are looking to see me drive not the fastest in either the real or virtual world, you will be able to do that in 2022. So thanks for watching, and what follows is a brief video or brief clip for each round of the 11 round championship and my general thoughts about those races. Thank you very much for watching. There will be more content coming in 2022. The season started late due to COVID restrictions, which were still in place around the country. Round 1 was at Clay Pigeon in Dorset at the end of April, which obviously weather turned out to be pretty good, as you can see. A few things were apparent at round 1 that really recurred throughout the entire season. I didn't qualify well. Qualifying was actually, or I was faster in practice than I was in qualifying, and also at the start of the race not really making up a lot of places at the start when you've got the most opportunities. The other thing was I moved to Sprint 60 for 2021. One thing that was immediately apparent was that it's a very competitive field. There's not a huge amount of spread, even the people near the back like myself, it's still pretty tight. 2 seconds difference between fastest and slowest laps in race 1, which is pretty small really considering. Footage you're seeing now was from the second race of the day, which was quite busy at the start, still quite a lot of fun. Overall I quite enjoyed the racing. As I said, the challenge was very clear from that first round, but overall wasn't too unhappy. Managed to make up some places in both race 1 and race 2, so ended up finishing 34th in race 1 and 31st in race 2. So overall, yeah, not too unhappy, and was looking forward to round 2. Lee said about our first visit to Whilton Mill for the season, the better probably. As you'll see from the footage, the weather wasn't great and I never really felt comfortable at any point. I kind of said to myself before we started that if I kept it clean and didn't make mistakes, that there would probably be good opportunities to make up places because of the conditions. and then did the exact opposite, managing to spin at the turn 1, turn 2 complex on the very first lap of practice, and to be honest it never really got much better from there. I had a few more spins in practice that really just completely sapped my confidence, and I basically struggled throughout. Easily the low point of the season. I felt I didn't really come away from it having learned anything or gained anything valuable. Drove home in the middle of a really nasty storm, aquaplaning in the outside lane of the M1, wondering why I spent my time like this. Two dreadful 37th placed finishes. I think, as I mentioned, easily the low point of the season. Round 3, on to Lydd. Our first visit to Lydd of the season. Lydd is quite a physical track to drive, or at least I find it quite a physical track to drive. The first 2 chicanes requiring pretty aggressive use of the curbs to get a decent lap time, and it's something that does take a bit of adjusting to be honest. Certainly the first time I drove at Lydd last season I did struggle physically, but it was better this time around. After what can only be described as a dreadful performance at round 2 at Whilton Mill, it was quite a relief that it was dry, as you can see. Overall it was steady but unspectacular really, but possibly understandable given how much my confidence had really been hit by the wet Whilton Mill. The footage here is from race 1. There was certainly a bit of action, a bit of excitement from the start. As I mentioned earlier, I really struggled to make progress early in the races, when it's much easier to make moves before the field starts to spread out. After about 2 or 3 laps, particularly somewhere like Lydd that's quite a long track, the field spread becomes quite great. And even if you make progress past people, the next kart to overtake is a fair distance down the track from you. Race 1 I managed to make up 4 places from my starting position to finish 31st, which was not too bad. The second race I slipped back a few places, which was quite disappointing, and also in the context of the season itself quite unusual. I mean, in pretty much every race I either held my starting position or took advantage of other people's misfortune or penalties or what have you, and to advance further up the field. So to actually lose places and slip back was a bit disappointing. On to round 4 and Buckmore Park. Now, Buckmore Park really looked like it was on shaky ground financially, having been hit very hard by lockdown. And it did look at one point that we wouldn't be going back there at all. So to go back to racing there was great, and I hope that Buckmore continues to flourish now the world is becoming a slightly more normal place. People do complain a bit about Buckmore because we do visit the track a lot. I mean, it's the one I've driven at the most, and that's pretty much in common for most of us. The pre-season test is in January is normally at Buckmore, so yeah, there's a good deal of familiarity there. It's an interesting track because it has quite a bit of elevation change, which is unusual. There aren't that many tracks we go to that have that kind of thing. So from the bottom of the circuit up past Cafe Corner to the start finish straight, you've got a fair uphill there, which means getting out of that bottom bend Garda is absolutely critical, because you're a full throttle there all the way around the track, or all the way up the hill past start finish straight. And if it's dry and if you've got big enough balls, possibly all through T1 and T2 as well, So that's really critical. And then the downhill section, which is quite physical, it has to be said, plunging downhill and then coming down to paddock is pretty interesting. And the first, actually Buckmore was the first place I did a full Sprint 60 round at in 2020. It was a very hot day and I was feeling really quite unwell. So, you know, it was nice to be back. I had good qualifying actually, well, for me, good qualifying, and I was starting 33rd, which was the best place I'd managed thus far. But again, I didn't really make much of that opportunity starting a bit further forward. And something I really need to work on in 2022 is making a fast start and making most of that congestion at the start, looking for the gaps and making moves. And that's to me particularly important, given that I'm going back to racing in sprints for some of the season. I'm also going to be racing as a super heavyweight, so I will have a front, mid and rear grid start. So I think that's going to be important, but you know, something I feel a bit more able to deal with than I did in my first season of sprints, when, to be honest, I really didn't know what I was doing a lot of the time. So yeah, looking forward to that. On to round 5, which was at Rye House, which is my local track, I suppose you can say. Well, it's the one that's closest to where I live, so I suppose that's my local track. And was the local track for some guy called Lewis Hamilton. Not really sure what happened to him, to be honest. I think he might have done something or other since karting days. Was involved in some sort of controversy. Personally, didn't see anything. Don't know what happened. One thing you have to say is the track surface at Rye House probably hasn't been changed since Lewis Hamilton was racing there. It's not in a very good state. And I wasn't actually sure if I'd been going back in 2022, and I think a lot of people didn't really fancy going back, to be honest. It seemed to be a bit of a negativity around it. But they are resurfacing the track. I think right now they're in the middle of resurfacing the track, so it's going to be a completely new surface for us to race on. And I'm going to be going back in there and racing in sprints, so that should be interesting. Opportunity to get on the internet, get live on the internet, not being very quick. Rye House is a bit of a funny track. It's very tight, very twisty. And I think, you know, if it was in a warehouse somewhere and it was an indoor track, you'd not be at all surprised and really not feel that you've been shortchanged particularly. So returning to the recurring themes, my practice and qualifying results weren't great, which meant I started from the back row of the grid. Not ideal on a track as small and as tight as Rye House. But there was a fair amount of carnage at the first hairpin on lap 1. Not at all unusual. Pretty much happens every start at Rye House, definitely in sprints and even, you know, in SP60. So yeah, not at all surprised. But this did help me get a decent result in the first race. Managed to gain 5 places from my pathetic starting position after everyone else decided to take themselves out. After all the excitement and action in race 2, in race 1 rather, race 2 was much less exciting, and I actually finished where I started in 31st. But still, I mean, overall, not hugely disappointing. But as I said earlier on, the recurring themes, if only I qualified better and then made more of the opportunities presented to me when people take their brains out and attempt to win at the first hairpin on the first lap, definitely would get much better results. So we've now reached round 6, which was the last round before the summer break, and was a new track for me in 2021 at Ellough Park in Suffolk. And it certainly looked like it had all the ingredients to be a fun track to race on from the footage I'd seen on the internet, and I was happy to say I wasn't disappointed. And I mentioned in my race report video that it might be my favourite track, and I think it might still be the case. It was great fun to drive, although results maybe didn't reflect that. My results at Llandow, the other new track that we visited in 21, were way better. So maybe Llandow's my favourite just because I went really well there. But Ellough's just a great track to drive at, to be honest. It's got a really nice flow, and it's a slightly longer than average lap for a kart track, which I think also helps a bit. And I managed to buck my recent trend, and despite having a few lockups and spins in practice, I managed to set my fastest time in the qualifying part, and it put me kind of in the middle of the super heavyweight field, which was quite good. The highlight of certainly the first race was a 15-lap battle with Tim Randall, which, to be fair, probably went on about 13 laps too long. I should have made a move earlier, but still, it was a huge amount of fun. I really enjoyed, driving the track and having a battle with someone. And Tim and I would cross swords a number of times over the course of the season, and generally it was good fun. And I'll put a link to that video, the 15-lap video, somewhere on the screen. But as I said, on reflection, I should have got past Tim earlier and made some more progress, but it was still a lot of fun. So, and after all, this is why we go racing, is to have fun. I'm not expecting a call from Mercedes if that Lewis Hamilton bloke I mentioned earlier decides not to come back. The second race, I didn't make any progress at all, so finished where I started. But an enjoyable day and a track I'm looking forward to going back to. It will be one of my 2022 sprint outings. So again, I'm hopeful that a combination of the track that I enjoyed, that I actually was reasonably, against the people I'm racing with, reasonably quick at times. Hopefully means that for sprints it will work in my favour, and mean I can get a decent result, particularly since I will obviously have front and middle and rear grid start in the heats. So on to round 7, the first round after the summer break, when people probably stayed at home and didn't go anywhere. Thanks, Mr. COVID. We're at Bayford Meadows. It was actually the second trip this year to Bayford, not racing, but the pre-season test was at Bayford earlier on in the year. So it's a track I've driven at a fair bit. Got a bit of a mixed relationship with Bayford. It is a technical track, and particularly the middle section with the hairpins. If you kind of make a mistake on one corner, that really causes you issues with the following corners, and just makes life difficult. And my results over the last couple of years at Bayford have been a bit mixed, but I still quite enjoy driving the track. It's quite a challenge, so I suppose that probably brings its own rewards, even if the results don't necessarily match. Another fundamentally poor qualifying session. I just didn't get any clean laps. I was actually dead last for race 1, which is not great, but being positive, certainly go forward from there. Race 1 had a fair bit of action, and I was actually able to pass some people and also benefited from misfortunes of others in the form of penalties to make some progress. So that was good. The footage that we're watching at the moment is from later in race 2, which really wasn't very interesting, to be honest. I managed to make up 5 places in race 1, so from the back of the grid managed to finish 33rd. Race 2, I was 33rd, having made up no places at all. The final race of the season would be Bayford, and would have all sorts of excitement and maybe a glimmer of hope for 2022. Round 8. So, off to Llandow. This was quite complicated in many ways due to COVID, which did disrupt the calendar a bit and was still disrupting us even in September. So we ended up with some back-to-back races, simply because trying to fit 11 rounds in with a reduced amount of time. So a week after having raced at Bayford, it was the long trip to South Wales, which was made even longer by the absolutely ridiculous traffic trying to get past Cardiff, with the somewhat optimistic 50-mile-an-hour speed limits. It's quite ironic when you're doing about 10 and there are signs telling you to drive at 50 to save the environment. Anyway, Llandow was the second of the new tracks that I'd race at during 2021, and like Ellough, I had no reference other than videos, but I just seemed to get on the track straight away, really gelled with it, and managed my best qualifying performance of the season, ending up 28th on the grid for race 1, which was great. I just felt confident, enjoyed it, and I just felt that I was quick, even before I managed to look at the results, so that was really, really good. Starting from my season's best grid slot, I was able to make a bit of progress and end up finishing 26th. And as you can see from the footage we've been watching, the first few laps had a bit of drama, and also I went quicker in the race and in qualifying, which was really good. So, and in fact I actually set my fastest time of the entire weekend on the final lap of the race, which again was really gratifying. Race 2 really didn't work out for me, and I struggled with a kart that seemed to be a bit down on top end compared with those around me, particularly seemed to struggle on the back straight, but still, race 1, as I mentioned, was season's best finish of 26th, which wasn't bad at all. And race 2 I managed 30th, which again, if you've stuck it out this long, you'll see that's above average from my normal finishing position, but it was just a bit of a downer compared with race 1. We were sitting on the grid for race 2 and I was full of positivity and thinking, wow, if I can make up 4 or 5 places here like I normally often do, I could actually legitimately be in the top 20, which would have been awesome, but it just didn't work out for me. So, back to my nemesis from earlier on in the season, Whilton Mill. So, I wasn't feeling particularly great when we turned up here. I mean, to be honest, first trip to Whilton Mill for round 2 was an utter shit show. Nothing went right. and I really wasn't looking forward to it. When I arrived at the track, it was really quite foggy and wasn't warm, which didn't exactly fill me with joy at all. Whilton is quite a low grip surface, and the idea of racing in fairly clammy, cold conditions really, I just didn't think it'd be great. But by the time we actually got down to racing after lunch, the sun was out, we had a dry track. But having said all of that, still struggled in qualifying. I was 34th on the grid. But race 1 did have its fair share of drama, so I did improve my starting position. The footage you're watching here is from race 2, when, as you would have seen, I got a bit of good fortune at the start of the race. Slipped back a little bit eventually, but managed a reasonable finish. So race 1 was 30th, and race 2 was 29th. So, in backing up a fairly strong weekend I had in Llandow. So good from that respect, and nice to get back to Whilton and come away feeling a bit more positive about things. I appreciate that some tracks you get on with and sometimes some you don't. It just comes down to slightly, personal preference. I don't really subscribe to the view that you have a bogey track necessarily, but I didn't want Whilton Mill to kind of be a bit of a mental block for me, having had such an awful time there, that every time we go there I'm just going to be on the back foot. So the penultimate round of the 2021 Club 100 Sprint 60 season took us back to Lydd for the second time. On the way down, driving down through Kent, down to the circuit, the weather was absolutely dreadful. Heavy driving rain, wind, it was just nasty. And when I got to the track, to be honest, I wasn't even sure if I'd see karts racing, but there they were. The endurance teams were out plugging away in just awful conditions. I mean, places you would have been better off in a boat, to be honest. But we were very fortunate to get the best conditions across the weekend, and if you don't believe me, just check out the sprint races over on the Alpha Live YouTube channel to see what it was like on Sunday. I mean, I was watching it in the warm at home, and it was unbelievable. Our practice session though was still a bit damp, and I had a lot of fun sliding the car around and managing not to spin, which was really good. It was really positive, again because of the experience of Whilton Mill. The footage here is from the first start of race 2, which definitely had the most dramatic incident of the Sprint 60 season, at least from the heavyweight point of view. I was lucky to avoid the 3-car pile-up, which you're going to see shortly, which ended up with the ambulance appearing on track and a red flag, which is obviously something nobody wants to see at all. But thankfully, there were no actual serious injuries. Everyone was able to restart after the incident, and it just serves as a timely reminder of the fact that even at our level, racing things that are just about capable of slightly over 50 miles an hour, it's still, it's still dangerous. People can still get hurt. It's not, it's not a no-risk exercise to go racing with people. But even so, despite the drama of the collision you're about to see, no one was hurt. Everyone was okay, and we were able to start after the red flag. Slightly abridged race, but still, everyone was out there and fine. Pretty sore the next day, I'm sure, but fundamentally okay. Race 1 was, here we go, this gratuitous slow-mo footage at the first appearance of my GoPro Max 360 camera, which is quite handy in this instant. Yeah, race 1 had a good finish, finishing 27th, gaining 7 places, which was my highest number of overtakes this season, so pretty good. Race 2, unfortunately, I had a kart that really wasn't performing well. It didn't happen to me very often this season, but it just wasn't. Lydd is a quick track, and the car I had wasn't quick, so I slipped back to 31st. But overall, can't be massively disappointed with it. So here we are, the final round of the 2021 season, back at Bayford Meadows. And with the heavyweight class running second on the day, we alternate with the lightweights. We'd be racing into dusk under the lights during race 2, which is quite pretty, if nothing else. Making progress during the early stages of the race is something I've struggled with this season, and something I've mentioned a couple of times already. But for the first time in race 1, I actually did a decent job of the start and was running as high as 26th at one point from 32nd on the grid, when a mistake on cold tyres saw me spin and then get hit by the following carts. To say I was quite angry at that point would probably be a bit of an understatement. Having ended up almost last after having such a strong start and starting to do well, and just effectively made a mistake myself that could have been avoided if perhaps I'd been slightly less aggressive on those cold tyres. I was determined to fight back and did manage to finish where I'd started in 32nd, so not ideal. The footage we're watching now is from the end of race 2 under the lights. The race was similarly scrappy. I made a decent start, but was victim of my own enthusiasm when I made a massively over-optimistic move, and the guy turned. I'm not portioning blame. Turned in probably quite rightly and just clipped the front of my car and span me. But at least this time I wasn't as far adrift from the rest of the pack because I hadn't been hit as I was in race 1. And the other thing was I had the kart that had won the lightweights race. So I'm not entirely sure it was any better than any of the others, but it was kind of like a psychological boost. It's like, look, if this kart has won and dominated the lightweights race, it can't be bad. And again, fought back through the field and managed to finish a bit further up than where I started, one place. So overall, the finishes were not great, but there's a bit of hope there in the fact I did fight hard at the start of the race, did make up places, and if I just had not made a stupid mistake, it could have been the best finish of the season. But as it was, 32nd and 31st, not great, but I was pleased by the fact that I fought back, managed to catch people up and managed to make up places, despite having made mistakes. So that's it, my review of my 2021 Club 100 Sprint 60 season. If you've made it this far, then congratulations. I plan to shoot videos of all the rounds in 2022, and hope to get them out on YouTube, there's a lot of effort required to shoot the videos and edit them afterwards and record voiceovers and try not to sound like a broken record. And I did really underestimate the effort required to do that, but I have enjoyed doing it. It is, if nothing else, from a selfish point of view, helpful for me, because it means I look at the footage, I look at my performance, and it does help me learn where I've made mistakes or where I can do things better. So all I can say is thank you for watching. There'll be more coming in 2022, and I look forward to seeing a lot of people back out on track again. It will be a bit different.